The last day of September, an Israeli airplane touches down at Manama Airport. Israel's foreign minister is on a landmark mission. He has come to Bahrain to open the regime's first embassy in the kingdom, 1 year after Manama and Tel Aviv normalized ties with each other. Unlike the Bahraini authorities, Bahraini people are not happy about the visit. This can be understood from the burning tires on the outskirts of the city. The protesters consider it as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause.
الحادث اللي حدث مؤلم جدا لجميع السعوديين.
After Al Khalifa declared that it would join the Abraham Accords in September 2020, 17 political and civil society organizations representing widespread segments of Bahrain's society signed a statement denouncing the decision. Yair Lapid's visit to Manama and his official meeting with King Hamad Al Khalifa dashed all the remaining hopes of reversing course in favor of the Palestinian people. In the words of Sheikh Hussein Al-Day, Deputy Secretary General of the opposition Al-Wafaq National Islamic Society, the visit of the Israeli Foreign Minister to Bahrain is an act firmly rejected, condemned, and denounced by the people of Bahrain. As a result, the Bahraini people, who care much about the fate of their Muslim brothers and sisters in the occupied territories, took to the streets to express their anger at a regime that cares the least, if any, about public opinion. Protesters chanted anti-government slogans, denouncing the unholy alliance between the two regimes of Bahrain and Israel. Bahrainis also went online, launching a campaign to voice their anger against the visit through hashtags such as Al-Bahrain Tarafaz Al-Sahayina, Bahrain Rejects Zionists, and Bahrainiyun Zet al-Tatbiq, and Bahrainis Against Normalization. Not surprisingly, the protests turned violent as the police fired tear gas canisters to disperse the angry yet peaceful crowd. But the Bahraini police did not stop there. Bahraini Pages reports that the security forces suppressed the demonstration rejecting normalization on Sitra Island, south of the capital.
It's important to stress that these protests were not necessarily on the scale of protests that we've seen before. The Bahraini government is keen to ensure there is no disruption to Yair Lapid's visit as it continues to try to improve ties with Israel as a result of the political benefits it believes that normalization of ties with Israel will bring. And therefore, the more potent of the protests that took place, police decided to deploy tear gas and decided to use force in order to suppress those protests, in order to prevent them from spreading through the Bahraini population. These protests that were supported, that were encouraged by an initiative that's called that roughly translates as the Gulf Alliance Against the Normalization of Ties Between the Gulf and Israel. So police managed to suppress some of these protests through the use of tear gas and the like in order to ensure that Yair Lapid's visit went smoothly.
According to Bahrain Al Yawm news website, a number of the protesters are still unaccounted for after they were summoned to appear at the police station.
The total number of peaceful demonstrations reached at least 20, some of which were met with repression by the security forces, who assaulted the demonstrators by beating them, throwing tear gas at them, and sound bombs, which led to the injury of a citizen. In addition, security forces summoned at least 14 citizens and detained at least 30 peaceful demonstrators who were added to the thousands of prisoners of conscience in the prisons of Bahrain.
There are also reports of widespread detentions regarding the recent protests, although the suppression and detention of protesters are nothing new in Bahrain. A despotic regime where the police and security forces respond to any minor objection with violence and all out of proportion. Since the 2011 nationwide protests in Bahrain, where people demanded freedom and structural reforms, things have just become worse, as opposition parties have become outlawed and the independent news outlets have been shut down.
We often see that there is arrest without charge. Political prisoners tend to languish in prison for years on end. Some of them end up dying in prison, and this is not just in Bahrain, this is in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other places as well. Even if we're looking at Qatar, where Hazza bin Ali, who protested the election law, is still in prison, still detained, and he's been in prison now for a few months. In other words, the treatment of opposition, the treatment of political prisoners has often been condemned by human rights organizations as not worthy of humanity, as oppressive, and where there's also reports of the use of torture and the like.
Moreover, in response to the increasing pro-democracy activism online, Manama has intensified its efforts to silence peaceful criticism and intimidate activists online under vague terrorist-related pretexts.
A Bahraini citizen may be imprisoned because of his participation in a peaceful demonstration or even because of a tweet in which he expressed his position on a specific event inside or outside Bahrain, as happened with one of the opposition figures, Nabil Rajab, or even may be held accountable for a mere intention, as happened recently with the human rights activist Mr. Ali Muhanna, who was summoned to the police station on charges of an intent to participate in a peaceful march against normalization with Israel and was forced to sign not to participate in any peaceful march.
As for the Abraham Accords, the Manama regime supports that it's all for the promotion of peace in the region. But ironically enough, the regime is prepared to commit any crime against anyone who opposes the deal.
So we call for coexistence for all nations, all peoples of the Middle East, to live side by side, despite differences in ideologies and religion and sect and ethnicity, live side by side to achieve stability, security, and prosperity for all nations of the Middle East.
Even months before the Accords, people in Bahrain criticized the Al Khalifa regime for paving the way for the Trump administration to sell what they call the deal of the century. For a large number of the Bahraini people, the Al Khalifa monarchy is already an illegitimate entity, never representing the people. A reason per se, Manama is avidly after strong ties with the Israeli regime, especially after the botched U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
More than anything else, it's about survival, it's about surviving as a regime, it's about adapting to the realities that are in the region, in which you have a U.S. hegemon power, U.S. military bases, U.S. that essentially exerts significant influence over foreign policy and the like, and therefore in order to have influence over the US, these Gulf states believe that it's essential to have ties with Israel.
As the Bahraini regime moves more away from its people, it has more to make overtures with others outside the country, including the Israelis. Suppressing the nation, burying the Palestinian cause, and outreaching the enemy are not forgivable sins, and the chickens will come home to roost sooner or later.
حادث مؤلم جدا لجميع السعوديين.